The year is 1893. Chicago, Illinois stands as the beating heart of the modern world. Gleaming and triumphant, the world's Columbian Exposition, the fabled White City, celebrates 4 centuries of progress. Millions flood the fairgrounds to marvel at the electric lights, the towering Ferris wheel, and drink in the promise of a new age. But just a few miles south, beyond the music and marvels, another kind of monument is rising in the working-class neighborhood of Inglewood. A strange, sprawling, 3-story structure, part hotel, part business block, part enigma. It belongs to a handsome young doctor with an impeccable smile and impeccable manners, Dr. H. H. Holmes. The newspapers would later christen this building with a name that would echo throughout history: the Murder Castle. This is the story we all think we know, a labyrinth of over 100 rooms designed for one unspeakable purpose, a maze of staircases that led to nowhere, doors that opened onto brick walls, soundproof chambers where guests checked in but never checked out, hidden gas jets controlled from Holmes' own office that could silently fill a room with poison, secret chutes and trap doors that sent bodies tumbling into the basement below, a subterranean workshop of horrors complete with acid vats, a crematorium, and dissecting tables where Holmes stripped flesh from bone, selling skeletons to medical schools for profit. It's the legend that's haunted America for over a century. H. H. Holmes, our first serial killer, the devil in the White City, a monster who may have claimed as many as 200 lives. But what if the most terrifying parts of that story, the gas chambers, the labyrinth, the hundreds of victims, isn't true? And what if the truth is far more unsettling? This is the story of how a legend was built, brick by brick, and how that legend nearly erased the real victims of America's first conman/killer. Because the real horror of H. H. Holmes isn't in the building he constructed, it's in the man himself. To understand the monster, we must first go back to childhood, where the roots of his evil began. Before he was H. H. Holmes, the Beast of Chicago, he was Herman Webster Mudgett, a gifted boy from a small town in New Hampshire. What happened in those early years to set him on a path of such profound darkness? The answer begins not with murder, but with fraud. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, to a wealthy, devout Methodist family. On the surface, it was a life of privilege, but behind closed doors, the Mudgett home was a place of fear. His father, Levi, was a harsh disciplinarian and a heavy drinker, known for physically abusing his children for the smallest infractions. Some accounts claim he would silence his children by holding kerosene-soaked rags over their mouths. From a young age, Herman displayed troubling signs. He was intensely intelligent, but socially isolated, and he developed a dark fascination with death. Biographers note that he began torturing animals, a well-known early indicator of psychopathy. A formative and perhaps embellished story from his childhood tells of bullies forcing him into a doctor's office and pushing his hands onto a human skeleton to frighten him. But instead of feeling terror, the experience allegedly sparked a morbid curiosity that would define his life. Although there's little evidence, some accounts even report that Herman may have been responsible for the death of another child in his hometown. These early experiences, the abuse at home, the social alienation, the burgeoning cruelty, created a personality devoid of empathy. He was learning to see other living beings not as subjects with feelings, but as objects for experimentation and control. He was a budding psychopath, and his intellect would make him an exceptionally dangerous one. At just 16, Mudgett graduated from high school and soon enrolled in medical school at the University of Michigan. For most, a medical education is a path to healing, but for Herman Mudgett, it was an apprenticeship in dehumanization. The anatomy lab became his classroom for crime. It provided him with the technical skills of dissection and an intimate knowledge of the human body. But more importantly, it gave him the psychological detachment to view corpses as mere commodities. It was here that Mudgett honed his true craft: fraud. He and his associates began stealing cadavers from the university lab. He would then take out life insurance policies on fictitious people, disfigure the stolen corpses to make them unrecognizable, and plant them at the scenes of a staged accident to collect the insurance money. This was his foundational criminal act. Long before he was a murderer, he was a con man who used human bodies as props for profit. This practice of objectifying the dead was the perfect training for objectifying the living. If a human body was just a tool to make a few $1,000s, what was a human life? This detachment extended to his personal life. At 17, he secretly married a young woman named Clara Lovering. They had a son, Robert, but Mudgett was reportedly abusive. And soon, he abandoned them both, moving on without a second thought, leaving them to return to New Hampshire while he pursued his schemes. It was the first in a lifelong series of betrayals, establishing a pattern of using women for money, comfort, or legitimacy, only to discard them when they were no longer useful. He would go on to marry at least 2 more times, bigamously, never bothering to divorce his previous wives. In 1885, with a medical degree in hand and a trail of scams and abandoned family members behind him, Herman Mudgett moved to Chicago. He needed a new name to escape his past and to build a new but respectable facade. He chose Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He took a job at a pharmacy owned by Dr. and Mrs. Holton in Inglewood. The popular legend says he murdered them both to seize the business. A neat, gruesome story that adds to his mystique. But it's also false. Both of the Holtons outlived Holmes by many years. The man who came to Chicago likely wasn't a murderer just yet, but he was something dangerous, a master manipulator, a liar so convincing he could sell anything, even his own innocence, and soon he would design the perfect stage for his deceptions. Chicago was a city of opportunity, and Holmes saw its chaos as his canvas. On the corner of 63rd and Wallace, he began constructing a building that would make him infamous. A strange, imposing structure that locals would come to fear. The first of his confirmed victims were Julia Connor and her young daughter Pearl. In 1890, Holmes hired Julia's husband, Ned, to manage the jewelry counter in his pharmacy. The Connor family, including 6-year-old Pearl, moved into an apartment in Holmes's building. It wasn't long before the charismatic doctor began an affair with Julia. When Ned discovered the betrayal, he confronted his wife. He refused to end the affair, and a heartbroken Ned left Chicago, leaving his wife and daughter in Holmes's care. Around Christmas of 1891, Julia and Pearl Connor vanished. When questioned, Holmes gave a story he would use again and again. He claimed Julia had died while he was performing an illegal abortion on her. It was a convenient lie that played on the taboos of the era and was difficult to prove. No bodies were found at the time. But years later, during the investigation of the castle, police discovered small, calcified bones and child's hair in the basement. It's now believed these were the remains of Pearl Connor. In May of 1892, Holmes hired a beautiful young woman named Emmeline Cigrand to be his personal secretary. Like so many others, Emmeline was taken in by his charm and apparent wealth. Holmes courted her, and soon they were engaged to be married. But by December of that same year, Emmeline also disappeared. Her family grew worried when her letters stopped. Holmes told them that she had run off and married another man. To others, he used his familiar excuse of a botched abortion. But the truth was far more sinister. It's believed that Emmeline, who worked closely with Holmes on his business dealings, had likely discovered the true extent of his fraud, or maybe his other marriages, and she'd become a threat. Holmes's next 2 victims were sisters, Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie Williams was an heiress with a considerable inheritance, making her a perfect target. Holmes met her, seduced her, and eventually married her in 1893, gaining control of her finances and convincing her to transfer a valuable piece of property in Fort Worth, Texas, into his name. The story is not too dissimilar to the story of Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, which we've covered on this channel here before. You can watch that video here, 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 I think. That summer, at the height of the World's Fair, Minnie's sister Nanny came to Chicago for a visit. Shortly after her arrival, both sisters disappeared forever. Holmes later gave conflicting accounts of their fates, at one point claiming to have locked one of them in a vault and listened as she died. Perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence related to this murder is a footprint. Some accounts from the time claim that investigators found the faint outline of a woman's footprint on the inside of the door to Holmes' large bank vault. It's a chilling image, suggesting that someone's final, desperate moments were spent kicking against the steel door of a makeshift tomb. The sisters' bodies were never recovered, but during the police search of the castle, investigators made a grim discovery in the ashes of the basement furnace. They found a woman's watch chain, later identified as belonging to Minnie Williams, and a garter buckle which belonged to her sister Nanny. It was all that was left of them. By the end of the World's Fair, Holmes' life in Chicago was a web of lies stretched to its breaking point. Predators were closing in, and the disappearances were starting to raise more questions. He needed to escape, and so he devised his most elaborate insurance fraud yet. A plan that would require the help of his longtime and trusted associate, a man named Benjamin Peitzel. Peitzel thought he was getting into a simple con job. He had no idea that he was signing his own death warrant, sealing the fate of his children. Benjamin Peitzel was a carpenter by trade, a man with a wife, Carrie, and 5 children. He'd been a loyal associate of Holmes for years, a sort of jack-of-all-trades accomplice in many of his smaller scams. Peitzel was a willing participant in fraud, but there's no evidence he knew about Holmes's more murderous side, and he trusted him. The plan was simple, a variation on a scam Holmes had been pulling since his university days. They would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy on Peitzel from the Fidelity Mutual Life Association of Philadelphia. Then Peitzel would fake his own death. They would procure a disfigured cadaver from a morgue, pass it off as Peitzel, and after Holmes, as the beneficiary's representative, collected the payout, they would split the money. Peitzel would then go into hiding with his family under a new name, and everyone would be rich. It seemed like the perfect crime. But Holmes had no intention of sharing the money. In September of 1894, in Philadelphia, the plan was set in motion. But instead of finding a substitute cadaver, Holmes just murdered his partner. The exact method is debated, but the autopsy later revealed that Peitzel had been poisoned with chloroform before his body was set on fire with benzene, an explosion staged to look like a lab accident. Holmes's cruelty then reached a new level of depravity. He knew that for the insurance company to pay out, the body would need to be formally identified by a family member. He traveled to St. Louis, where the Peitzel family was waiting, and told Carrie Peitzel that the plan had gone off without a hitch, but that her husband was now in hiding and couldn't risk being seen. He then convinced Carrie to let him take her 15-year-old daughter, Alice, to Philadelphia to identify the body. He told the girl that the disfigured corpse they would see was not her father, but a stranger, and that she had to play along for the con to work. The terrified teenager did just as she was told, identifying the burned body as her father, never realizing she was looking at his actual. With the insurance money secured, Holmes returned to the grieving, unsuspecting Carrie Peitzel. He told her that Ben was alive and well, hiding out in London, and that it was too dangerous for the whole family to travel together. With his incredible powers of persuasion, he convinced the desperate mother to hand over custody of 3 of her 5 children: Alice, 11-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard. He promised he would take them to their father, while Carrie and her 2 other children traveled separately. For months, Holmes led this fractured family on a horrifying journey across the United States and Canada. He kept the children isolated, constantly moving them from city to city, while simultaneously sending Carrie on a parallel path, always keeping them just out of reach of one another. He would tell Carrie she'd just missed Ben and the children in one city, while telling the children their mother was waiting in the next. It was a sadistic game of cat and mouse, a prolonged act of psychological torture that served no purpose other than to exert his absolute control. But Holmes had made a crucial mistake. Back when he was briefly jailed for a horse theft scheme in St. Louis, he'd boasted about his Peitzel insurance plan to a fellow inmate. When that man, a train robber named Marion Hedgepath, learned that Holmes had cut him out of a deal, he tipped off authorities. The The case, which began as a simple fraud investigation, landed on the desk of a tenacious Philadelphia police detective named Frank Geyer, and the chase for H. Holmes and the missing Peitzel children began. Detective Geyer was a methodical, relentless investigator, a stark contrast to the often ineffective police work of the era. In June of 1895, he set out to retrace Holmes's twisted path. His only clues were rental records and a collection of heartbreaking letters the Peitzel children had written to their mother and grandparents, letters Holmes had intercepted and cruelly kept from them. Geyer's journey became a grim travelogue of Holmes's evil. He followed the trail from Cincinnati to Indianapolis, then to Detroit, and finally across the border into Toronto, Canada. At each step, he interviewed landlords, neighbors, and merchants, slowly piecing together the movements of a man traveling with three sad, isolated children. Witnesses recalled a man who kept the children indoors, who bought strange items like a large trunk and a shovel, and who always seemed to be in a hurry to leave. The first breakthrough came in Indianapolis. Geyer tracked Holmes to a small rental cottage in the suburb of Irvington. There, after speaking with neighbors who recalled Holmes asking to borrow a spade, Geyer began a search of the house. Inside the chimney flue, he made a horrifying discovery: teeth, a piece of a jawbone, and charred bunches of organs. They were the remains of 8-year-old Howard Peitzel. But Alice and Nellie were still missing. Geyer hoped to catch up with Holmes before it was too late. The trail led Geyer to Toronto. He located a house Holmes had rented at 16 St. Vincent Street. The landlord told Geyer a strange story. The tenant had borrowed a spade, claiming he needed to dig a spot in the cellar to store potatoes for his sister. With a growing sense of dread, Geyer and the Toronto police went to the house and began to dig in the earthen floor of the cellar. And just a few feet down, they found them: the bodies of Alice and Nellie Peitzel, stuffed into a shallow grave. They had been locked inside a large trunk, and a hole was drilled into the lid. Holmes had attached a hose and gassed them to death before burying them. Detective Geyer's brilliant and heartbreaking investigation had finally brought an end to the chase. H. Holmes, the master of deceit, was arrested in Boston in November of 1894, just before he could lure Carrie Peitzel and her remaining 2 children to their deaths. The nation was horrified by the discovery of the Peitzel children, but the story was far from over. When the news of his capture broke, the public's fascination reached a fever pitch. With a search warrant in hand, police entered the structure at 63rd and Wallace Avenue, and what followed would cement Holmes' reputation in infamy. Newspapers across the country began printing wild accounts of what they called the Castle of Horrors. Whole pages were dedicated to maps of the chilling house. The stories grew more grotesque with each passing day. The Chicago Times-Herald called it a house of many murders, while others dubbed Holmes the modern Bluebeard. The idea of a handsome doctor who designed a building solely for killing was too sensational to resist. Within weeks, the phrase murder castle entered the national lexicon. The stories described a maze of bizarre features: narrow winding hallways, staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened onto solid brick walls. The second and third floors were said to be a honeycomb of small, windowless rooms, many of them soundproofed and equipped with gas pipes that Holmes could control from a panel in his own office. The most infamous feature was a large, airtight bank vault, where he could allegedly lock his victims and listen as they slowly suffocated. From these torture chambers, the legend continues. Trap doors and greased chutes delivered the bodies to the basement. There, Holmes had assembled a gruesome workshop, operating tables for dissection, pits filled with quicklime and acid to dissolve remains, and a massive kiln disguised as an oil furnace to cremate what was left. This was the murder castle, a place built to lure, kill, and dispose of the thousands of tourists flocking to the 1893 World's Fair. The story is well known, it's terrifying, and it's also probably false. Thanks to the work of modern historians, it's now suspected the reality of the building was far more mundane, though its purpose was still sinister. Let's dismantle the myth, piece by piece. First, the building never actually operated as a hotel for the World's Fair. The ground floor was occupied by various storefronts, including Holmes's own pharmacy. The second floor contained apartments, but they were for long-term rental, not for transient hotel guests. Holmes did begin construction on a third floor in 1892, telling investors it would be a hotel, but it was never finished, never furnished, and never opened to the public. So the entire hotel story was a front for a massive financial scam. Second, the labyrinthine design likely wasn't for murder, it was for fraud. Holmes hired and fired numerous construction crews throughout the project, ensuring that no single person understood the building's complete layout. This constant confusion allowed him to default on payments to workers and rack up enormous debts with suppliers for materials he never intended to pay for. The so-called secret passages and hidden rooms weren't for trapping victims. They were for hiding furniture and other goods he'd bought on credit whenever repossession agents came knocking. On one occasion, a janitor revealed that Holmes had moved an entire apartment's worth of furniture into a single room and simply walled up the door to avoid detection. These walled-up rooms may have been the basis for the later report of halls or stairs that led to nowhere. Finally, the so-called torture devices were all gross exaggerations. The building did have a chute, but it was a common laundry chute. It did have a walk-in vault, but this was not unusual for a business owner at the time. And there's no credible evidence of gas chambers or a purpose-built crematorium for human bodies, although there was a large furnace in the basement for heating. The building was a monument to Holmes's deceit, a physical manifestation of his life as a con man. So how did this myth become so popular? The answer lies in the media landscape of the 1890s. This was the era of yellow journalism, a period of intense competition between newspaper titans like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. In the race for readership, sensationalism sold papers, and the truth was often a secondary concern. Speculation like this was able to flourish because of the severe limitations of 19th century forensic science. In an age before fingerprinting was widely used, before DNA analysis, and before standardized crime scene investigation, there was very little physical evidence to contradict the wild claims of the press. Criminal investigations relied almost entirely on witness testimony, confessions, and circumstantial evidence. This created the perfect environment for a myth to be born, and over time to be accepted as fact. The legend of the murder castle serves a crucial psychological function. It frames Holmes as an almost supernatural monster, an arch-fiend who existed far outside the bounds of normal society. This makes his horror more manageable, but the truth is far more threatening. The truth is that Holmes wasn't an aberration hiding in a haunted house. He was a charming man who moved easily through high society, and he murdered people who knew him, trusted him, and loved him. Now the man who spent his entire life crafting lies and harming people would have to face a jury. What happens when a pathological liar is put on the stand and forced, for the first time, to answer for his crimes? In October 1985, H. Holmes stood trial in Philadelphia. Despite the string of disappearances in Chicago and the horrifying discovery of the Peitzel children, he was only charged with a single count of murder, that of his business partner, Benjamin Peitzel. The evidence for the other murders was considered too circumstantial for the time, but the Peitzel case, thanks to Detective Geyer's work and the insurance fraud paper trail, was pretty solid. In an act of arrogance, Holmes fired his court-appointed lawyers and made an unprecedented request for a murder trial. He'd represent himself. This was to be his final and greatest performance. He saw the courtroom not as a place of judgment, but as a stage where he was the star. His behavior during the trial was a masterclass in narcissistic pathology. He was contemptuous and nasty towards the prosecutor. He constantly deflected questions, and he attempted to control every aspect of the proceedings, demanding scientific analysis of all evidence. His central defense was a blatant lie. He claimed that Benjamin Peitzel was not only still alive, but had conspired with his wife to defraud the insurance company, and that the body found in Philadelphia was a substitute. It was a desperate and convoluted story that he failed to support with any evidence. His performance backfired spectacularly. His cold and calculating demeanor did nothing to endear him to the jury. The defining moment of the trial came after the prosecution presented a detailed, grotesque description of Peitzel's decomposed corpse. As the courtroom sat in stunned silence, Holmes, seemingly unfazed, casually requested a lunch break. The jury was horrified by his callousness. It was a fatal error that revealed the empty space where his humanity should have been. And the verdict was swift. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting his execution in Moyamensing prison, Holmes embarked on his final con. He was offered $7,500, a massive sum at the time, equivalent to over $250,000 today, by the Hearst newspaper syndicate for his full confession. What followed wasn't an act of remorse, but a calculated business transaction designed to shape his own dark legend. He produced a series of contradictory and self-serving accounts. First, he wrote a memoir from his cell titled Holmes's Own Story, in which he proclaimed his complete innocence. He admitted to being a swindler, but painted himself as a victim, a man who was railroaded by a sensationalist press and crooked police. Then, after his conviction was sealed and his appeals exhausted, he produced the confession Hearst had paid for. It was a lurid, shocking document in which he admitted to murdering people. It was in this confession he penned his most famous and chilling line, quote, "I was born with the devil in me. I couldn't help the fact that I was a murderer no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." This confession became a primary source for the Holmes legend, filled with details of the murders of the Connors, the Williams sisters, and the Peitzels. Among the other murders claimed by Holmes were some that are unproven, such as the strange disappearance of 17-year-old Emily Van Tassel. According to the July 29, 1895 Indianapolis Journal, Emily disappeared just 3 weeks after courting a man named Holmes about 4 times in 1892. Her mother never saw her again, and when the news broke of Holmes' arrest, the distraught mother met with Chicago detectives to learn if any evidence of her daughter had been found in Holmes' property. Unfortunately, though, no more information about Emily, also sometimes referred to in the press as Edna, is available. There is also Holmes' own account of killing 2 people in a tiny Indiana town near the Illinois border with Schneider. This claim in itself wouldn't be terribly believable, except that in 1919, 2 skeletons were found on a farm in that area, one of them with a bullet hole in the skull. Some of the locals in 1919 claimed to recall Holmes visiting their town sometime in the 1890s with a man and a woman. Then only days later, Holmes was seen once again, but this time alone, leading to speculation that the couple had been murdered. In total, Holmes claimed responsibility for the deaths of 27 people. However, this too was a web of lies. An analysis of the confessed murders shows that Holmes took credit for killing several people who were later found to be very much alive, including a former medical school classmate and a woman named Kate Durkee. He also claimed to have murdered Dr. Robert Leacock for insurance money in 1886, but it turns out that man actually died of natural causes in 1889. So why would he lie in his own confession? Well, it's actually not that uncommon. It even occurred in the last case we covered. It's likely because H. Holmes was a narcissist and a manipulator to his very core. By confessing to the crimes he didn't commit alongside those he did, he was muddying the historic record forever. He was seizing control of his own narrative, ensuring the full truth would always be debated, granting himself a twisted form of immortality. It wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was about curating his legacy as the greatest criminal of the century. It was his final performance and his most enduring con. On May 7th of 1896, Herman Webster Mudgett, aka H. Holmes, was led to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison. He was reportedly calm and pleasant, showing no signs of fear or remorse. He had one last, bizarre request. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement and that he be buried in a grave 10 foot deep. The man who spent his life mutilating and dissecting the bodies of others was terrified his own body would suffer the same fate at the hands of grave robbers. It was a final and fitting irony. The execution itself was botched. The drop didn't break his neck, and he strangled slowly for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. The beast of Chicago was gone, but the monster he created in the public imagination was just beginning its life. In the year following Holmes's execution, the castle itself met a grim fate. In October 1895, just months after Holmes was jailed, the building was destroyed by a fire of unknown origin. Rumors swirled that it was deliberately set, perhaps to hide remaining evidence. Others say a caretaker may have lit a furnace improperly. Whatever the cause, the blaze gutted the structure. The site stood as a charred ruins for years, a haunting reminder of the crimes within. Eventually, in 1938, the remains of the castle were torn down. Today, if you walk to that corner of Chicago's Englewood neighborhood, you'll see only a small post office building standing where Holmes's mansion once lived. The story has one last strange chapter in 2017. Due to a century of rumors that Holmes bribed his way to freedom, his coffin was exhumed at his descendants' request. Thanks to the cement Holmes had requested in his coffin, there was enough biological material left, even after more than 120 years, to test. That DNA was compared to DNA from some of his descendants, and sure enough, the DNA was a familial match, confirming that Holmes did indeed meet his end in 1896. We began this journey with the legend of the Murder Castle and a diabolical monster who preyed on the innocent during the Chicago World's Fair. But as we've peeled back the layers of myth, sensationalism, and outright lies, we've found a truth that is both less fantastical but also more profoundly disturbing. For me, the true horror of H. Holmes wasn't in secret passages or gas chambers, but it was in his charm, his smile. It was his ability to make people trust him, right up until the moment he destroyed them. He wasn't a madman building a monument to death. He was a cold, calculating predator whose only motivations were greed and control. He was primarily a psychopath, a man utterly devoid of empathy and remorse, things that make us human. The myth of the castle, born from the yellow journalism of the 1890s and nurtured by Holmes's own final manipulative performance, has allowed us to forget that. It turns a real-world predator into a boogeyman, a horror movie villain, and in doing so, it does a profound disservice to the real people whose lives he stole. They weren't anonymous faces in a crowd. They weren't nameless statistics in a tally of 200. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and fathers. So the story of H. Holmes isn't really a scary story about a murder castle. It's a timeless cautionary tale about a type of person who still walks among us. The charismatic manipulator who sees other people not as human beings but as objects to be used, pawns in their own selfish game. The greatest defense we have against them isn't to look for monsters in the shadows, but to recognize the coldness that can hide behind the most charming of faces. We must remember the truth, not the legend, because evil rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it looks like one of us. If you believe we earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. As a small channel, viewers like you, yes you the person watching this, I'm talking directly to you, you make a massive difference. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.